Hey folks, welcome to the DarkHorse podcast. I have the great pleasure today of sitting with Dr. Lydia McGrew, who is an expert in philosophical epistemology, which I will ask her to define here in a moment for those who don't know quite what that means. Lydia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bret.
So before we get to the reason for our conversation, why don't you tell us what epistemology is?
Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, and so it has to do with evidence and being rational and justified in believing things. And I've worked in informal epistemology, which is sometimes called classical, and then in recent years, formal epistemology, where you try to make mathematical models of how this kind of thing works.
Excellent. And is it fair to say that all human knowledge is derived from randomized controlled trials?
I would not say that's necessarily fair. There are a lot of different places where human knowledge comes from, including term definitions and immediate sensation, just all kinds of different sources of knowledge. So I wouldn't say that's true, but some human knowledge does.
Well, that's a great relief, because I've felt in recent months that I was going crazy because I keep being assured that the only way to know anything is through a randomized controlled trial, and I'm sure that can't quite be right. So anyway, you've reassured me. All right. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, and you have worked in both formal and informal epistemology. And for those who are perhaps wondering why anyone would study such a thing, I will just say that this is one of these fields where most people don't have to interact with it, but ultimately it has to be properly understood in order for us to evaluate different kinds of knowledge and to understand how we are to function integrating them, for example. So I will say I've studied a certain amount of philosophy of science, and although it comes up less often than you might imagine in regular conversation, the degree to which the things that are important in people's minds depend on the philosophy of science being rigorously understood is quite extreme. So anyway, thank you for bringing that to DarkHorse. Now let's talk about the immediate reason for our conversation. You have had a vaccine injury. Is it fair to say that?
Yes, it is.
All right. And I will say I have suffered the accusation of being an anti-vaxxer, which is a preposterous accusation in my case for a number of reasons. I'm, one, highly vaccinated against a wide range of things, some of them rather exotic. And two, I'm also a big fan of the idea of vaccination. I think it is incredibly elegant that we can inform the immune system about pathogens that we have not encountered and no ancestor of ours has encountered, so that it will get the jump on those things when we do encounter them. This is a beautiful system, and I in no way am opposed to us wielding it to the medical benefit of people or to the epidemiological benefit of society. Now, I also know you can't possibly be an anti-vaxxer either, because you wouldn't have a vaccine injury if you had been one, because you wouldn't have gotten vaccinated. Is that a fair characterization?
Right. And also, I wasn't in any way required to. That's the other thing. I don't work outside the home. So I suppose you could have someone who was an anti-vaxxer and had their arm twisted, but that wasn't the case. I just went out and decided to do it in my case.
Yes, I very nearly got vaccinated too. I did not, because I was concerned that there were risks that we obviously couldn't rule out early in the process. And so in effect, I was delaying vaccination in order to know more about what happened to people who were vaccinated. And the more I heard, the more alarmed I became. But I'm not an anti-vaxxer. You're not an anti-vaxxer. And when did you get your vaccination?
April 14th.
April 14th. And which one did you get?
It was Pfizer, first dose.
First dose. And did you have your reaction to the first dose, or did you get a second?
I only got the first dose. I had my adverse event in response to that first dose and definitely did not want the second one.
All right. And what was your reaction?
So that very night, I started getting some allergic symptoms, itching ears and head. And then and that was at the same time as the expected things, fatigue and that sort of thing that everybody thought. Within those couple of first days, I started getting nerve pains. And if you've ever had nerve pains, they're very distinctive. They're a zinging feeling. And I would get those in different places of my body. I was a little worried. I thought maybe the shingles that I had the previous year was coming back, but it never developed like shingles. Over the next couple of weeks, I kept having those. I would call them sort of wandering nerve pains. But I didn't get too worried until about 3 weeks later, when it revved, it zinged way up to extreme pain in my back and my tailbone and buttocks and legs. My legs started feeling very heavy, all kinds of things, many different places, zinging in my eyes and my face, and paresthesia in my face and that kind of thing. And basically, to make a long story short, the doctors are baffled. I'm just taking gabapentin for nerve pain at this point, which is not therapeutic. It's just for the pain. And it's been 7 months and nobody's found any effective treatment. And my symptoms just kind of go up and down and up and down and up and down. And I have a terrific amount of pain and nobody seems to have a solution. So I'll keep it that short. There are other symptoms as well, but I don't want to make the list too long. I do have tinnitus, which is somewhat recognized. So maybe some people will recognize that too, just to show the variety of symptoms involved.
Yeah, I've heard terrifying stories of tinnitus beyond what a human being can tolerate. It's really an incredibly frightening thing. I have a certain amount of tinnitus, and I must say most of the time I don't even realize it's there unless I listen for it. But a tinnitus that's absolutely unignorable. I've heard comparisons to freight trains.
And mine is not my worst symptom, but it's, when the other symptoms zoom up, that kind of zooms up too. So,
all right. Now let's be cautious here. Obviously, there is some possibility that what we have is mere coincidence, that something medically anomalous happened to you, and that the coincidence in time of it following your vaccination is not causal, but it seems so because we humans, for very easily understood adaptive reasons, are always looking for connections because very frequently we find them, they are real, and we can make use of them. What can you tell us about the possibility that what you're dealing with is an unfortunate medical situation that doesn't have anything to do with the vaccination you got?
In my own case, I think that's particularly unlikely for several reasons. First of all, my complete good health right up until I went in, and we were even joking about things like, oh, maybe you're going to grow another head or whatever. I wasn't anxious or anything like that. Secondly, the fact that the initial symptoms did come on along with the expected symptoms, and within that expected 48-hour time window when you do expect to get side effects, and everybody expects to get side effects, and then it seemed to grow out of that. And then thirdly, what I imagine we'll talk about more, which is the similarity to other side effects that I have only subsequently learned about that other people have had.
So, all right, what was your experience in terms of, so you had this event, you got a vaccination that you believed was safe enough to be worth taking and effective enough at something we both agree is dangerous, COVID, that you went and got it, and then you started having reactions, some of them within the range of normal, many of them not within the range of normal and alarming. What did you do next?
You go to doctor after doctor after doctor. Yeah, I got in touch with my primary care doctor. I kept her, very informed. She was very concerned. At first, she urged me to get the second vaccine, but when things got bad enough, she kind of stopped, pushing that. You research, you get online, you Google, you try to figure out what to do. I kept a lot of records of my symptoms, especially in like my messages on the MyChart portal to my doctor. Oh, this new thing has happened. This new thing has happened. Also, we tried Valtrex, which is a antiviral medication in case it was shingles coming back. And so we tried to get right on that. That didn't help. And then the other thing we tried was prednisone, which is an anti-inflammatory, pretty standard anti-inflammatory. That didn't seem to be helping. And then later I had a second round of that at a much higher dose that actually seemed to make matters worse for reasons unknown. So, we did try some reasonable things. And after that, all you can do is keep making appointments with new specialists to see if they'll have any additional ideas. Was there agreement amongst the doctors that you saw that what you were dealing with was a reaction to the vaccine? My PCP seemed to think so. She and I both at first thought maybe it was the shingles because we had heard of shingles being, that was like a known thing that sometimes it brought it back up. But then when there were no lesions and it didn't stay in one place on one side of the body, then we weren't sure what to do. The first immunologist I saw immediately agreed that it was. And in fact, he said verbally to me, this is why we usually test these for 2 to 3 years because of autoimmune disorders that can arise. I've had one neurologist also say it. I found that other doctors will tend to just record that that's what I said and not necessarily give me a strong opinion one way or another. I mean, I've been lucky that nobody said you're totally crazy, but I don't want to say that they've all just spontaneously, happily agreed that it's what it is. I think there's a certain amount of caution. All right. You had an immunologist tell you that as he saw it, this did appear to be a reaction to the vaccine. I will say one of the things that alarmed me was that given that we couldn't possibly have had any information on the long-term effects of these things, that we were portraying them as safe, which anything that interacts with the immune system and for which we don't have any long-term information about what has happened to people who've taken it can't really be safe because its whole purpose is to modify this fundamental system. And, we have allergic disorders, we have autoimmunity. There are many ways in which that system can be disrupted in a very negative way. So anyway, interesting to hear that an immunologist saw this as quite likely to be causal. Yep, definitely. All right. So in addition to the doctors that you saw, did you encounter others who had similar stories? So at first I didn't. I thought of myself as kind of a unicorn, and my family, of course, all believed me. They were appalled, but other immediate members of my family didn't have a problem. So I kept hearing, safe, 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 rare, rare, rare. So I thought, I guess I must just be one of those really, really rare things. And I forget what first prompted me to be, it was just in all the Googling I was doing. I came across the story of a young girl named Maddie de Garay, who is now 13. She was 12. She was in the Pfizer trial for 12 to 15-year-olds. Now she is in a wheelchair, but various of her symptoms were similar enough to mine, only more extreme, that I said, maybe there are more people out there. So I began looking a little further and eventually got connected with a couple of Facebook groups that are, documenting these things and bringing people together who all claim to have been vaccine injured by these vaccines. And I was just astounded by the similarity. In fact, let's come back to that in a second. I do want to point out a couple things about the Maddie de Garay story that are worth mentioning. First off, she's very severely injured. She's in a wheelchair. I think you said, as far as we know, she will require one for the rest of her life. She's also on a feeding tube. This is a previously healthy child. In the trial itself, my understanding is that her
symptoms caused them to, quote unquote, unblind the study, that is, to reveal that she got the vaccine rather than the placebo immediately, ostensibly so that she could be properly treated. But what this did was it had effects. Again, this is my understanding from others. It had effects on the continuing of the collection of data. So she was recorded as having had stomach upset, when in fact she is crippled and now requiring of a feeding tube and a wheelchair. And so in some sense, this is, yes, an anecdote. It's one individual. And again, there is a remote possibility that something simply coincidental could explain this. On the other hand, healthy children don't suddenly end up in wheelchairs and needing feeding tubes very frequently. This is an extremely rare event. And when we say, well, the trials showed these things to be safe, that depends on the trials having been well done. It depends on things like us continuing to track people whose story does not suggest that they had a smooth ride. And Maddie de Garay's case says exactly the opposite. It says that there are things that we should know that are not widely known. All right. Now, you said you found a Facebook group or several?
Yeah, a couple of them. I was going to mention, too, that if you look up that Pfizer 12 to 15-year-old trial, you will not find it easy to find it mentioned that there was even a single child who had an adverse event this extreme. And adverse events don't have to be designated necessarily as causal. They're just supposed to be recorded. When you do a trial, you just record your adverse events among the test group and your adverse events among the placebo group. And then the idea is, you compare and see if there's a statistically significant difference. You're not supposed to just make up your mind ahead of time, well, this wasn't caused, so we're not going to talk to people about it. And I actually had someone whom I mentioned, Maddie, who went and looked it up, and she said, well, I wonder if her parents are just completely faking this, because I can't find any mention of this in the Pfizer trial. And I'm like, well, that's pretty creepy, because if nothing else, there's nobody who's questioning that she was in the Pfizer trial.
Right.
And so you should at least be able to find it mentioned somewhere other than Fox News that there was a child who was in the Pfizer trial and these events happened while she was in the Pfizer trial.
Right. So
that's really striking.
This gets to questions of epistemology, because at some level, let's give, I won't even call it the benefit of the doubt, because I think it stretches a good bit beyond that. But let's bend over backwards to imagine that this is actually not a meaningful event in some way. All right. It is still important that one child had a serious medical mishap shortly after being vaccinated. Even if these things were unconnected, it is important that that data point land correctly so that we can begin to detect a pattern should it emerge. If what we do is we behave in such a way that that data point vanishes, and she's not really an anecdote. She was a data point. She was in the trial.
She was in the trial. That's right. That's how you do trials.
To the extent that that data point doesn't show up because it was recorded early as a stomach upset, maybe at the point that it plausibly was, but then it developed into a crippling injury, and that happened, after the trial had been unblinded, that is no reason not to maintain that piece of evidence so that we can look at it later if others who were in the trial, for example, show up with a similar set of symptoms. If we disappear that data point, even if we think we're doing the right thing, we have made it impossible for us to recover the pattern later should we need to. All right. So you found several Facebook groups. Who was in them? What were they like?
Well, so the largest one has, as of now, over 1,500 people. And people can only join if they present to the moderators a story indicating that they either believe they were vaccine injured by one of these or that a family member that they're acting on behalf of was. And they're very careful. They will not allow any general anti-vax sentiment to be expressed. I mean, it's like, that's not what we're here for. We're here to share our anecdotes. We're here to talk about what helped, what didn't help, what doctors we've been to, and that kind of thing. So they're actually trying to be very, very careful about that. And what I discovered and was just astonished by is that there is all of this similarity to my own experience, only it's also varied. So, for example, one person's terrible pain might be in the feet. I have some neuropathy in my feet, but that's not where my terrible pain is. Or somebody else's terrible pain might be in the, like headaches, horrible headaches or something like that. Or their whole arms might be terribly burning. So there's this variation, but the similarity is neuropathy, and a lot of it is connected to the nerves, some kind of neuropathic apparent connection. That really struck me because I knew I had recorded my symptoms independently. I knew I wasn't coming in here and saying this because they were saying it. I had said it already, and then I found them saying it. Now, I should mention that one of my articles that was published several years ago, in fact, several of them have had to do with the question of independence in witness testimony. So when you're interviewing people who've seen a car accident or whatever, how do you know if they've contaminated each other's testimony, or if they're copying or colluding, even deliberately colluding? And so one of the things that you look for is substantial agreement with circumstantial variety, similarity, but with variety. And so that was what I was finding here, because that indicates independence. I was very, very struck by that, that in these groups where these people, they come from all over the world, they come from different parts of the country, they had different shots. Let me also mention, they didn't all just have one shot. We were getting the substantial agreement with circumstantial variety.
Right. So this is actually a very powerful kind of evidence, because it is, of course, plausible that people could talk themselves into believing that they had symptoms from hearing what others had. And if any of those symptoms are in any way subjective, then you could imagine a group of people suddenly reporting the same illness and it not being physiological in nature. On the other hand, you had an experience where you had written down your symptoms, not realizing that there were lots of people having symptoms. So you had a list that was independent, and then you found there were others, and then you compared notes, and those notes had a lot of overlap and then a bunch of variation. As you point out, lots of people have pain, but it's not always in the same place. Mm-hmm. That's not people copying each other. That's people reporting what they're experiencing.
Right. The other thing I want to note about independence that the moderators don't necessarily like on the group, but that I find useful as an epistemologist, people will come newly into the group and not search the archives. And they'll say, thanks for the ad. I'm this many months past my vaccination. Has anyone had this symptom? And I don't think anybody could fake that to come in. I'm going to pretend I didn't, read the archives. No, and so they're listing it. And the rest of us are sitting there like, yeah, literally hundreds of us have had this symptom. I don't want to discourage you, but it's not going to stop anytime soon, I'm like, oh my God, my arms are burning or whatever, and so you can tell that those people are independent as well, because they're coming in, they're brand new, and they just didn't bother to read the archives, and they're reporting a symptom.
Right. Now, I must say, it is also interesting, a piece of evidence here. And again, I'm not saying I know how one should categorize it, but I know that in my life, a large number of people have had some serious event. In fact, you and I are not independent of each other, although you and I had not met until we had a preliminary conversation last week. It happens that I have known your daughter online for years. We've interacted on Twitter, and I've met your husband at a conference. So we are not very far apart, and yet you are yet another person who is a degree or two of separation from me, who is reporting, hey, I thought the vaccine was a good idea. I got vaccinated, and lo and behold, you never guess what happened, but I had the following experience. Some of those people have gotten better. Some of them are dealing with continuing issues, as you are, but it's an alarming number of people, given what must be a pool of a few hundred people in connection to me. So in any case, all right, I know from others who have contacted me for whom I do not have a prior connection, and therefore I have to be a little bit more skeptical about what I'm hearing, because, to the extent that there are people out there who are, right, I don't know, susceptible. They have an agenda. Well, they might have an agenda, or I can imagine people being hypochondriacal and hearing that this thing is out there and convincing themselves. So, I am skeptical when people approach me, but I know, as I've talked to many such people, they've been in the Facebook groups. They've been to doctor after doctor. Some of them have been told this is in your mind, even though their symptoms do appear to line up in the way that you're suggesting. But I also know that there's been some tech skullduggery surrounding these groups that existed where people had gathered to talk about what was happening to them, to pool information, to figure out if anybody had discovered anything useful to do to get rid of symptoms, had discovered doctors who were productively treating these things. Were Facebook groups disbanded?
Yeah, I've heard of it too. It hasn't happened since I've been part of it, but the moderators are constantly carefully moderating and telling us, be careful what you say here, because of course you could get, even if I may say so, a mole. Also, the robots are constantly reading the posts and popping up, COVID vaccines are safe, et cetera, if anybody uses the V word. And so, just we have to be careful and even have backup groups on other platforms if these were to get shut down, where we could regather.
All right. Now, what I would most like to do, as a scientist and a theorist, I frequently encounter people who will tell me that, they will say with a glimmer in their eye that the plural of anecdote is not data, yes. Right? Now, I also know that at some level, the word anecdote is misused by people. It's used effectively to dismiss a piece of evidence rather than allow it to be integrated at a natural level. And it is certainly the case that a single anecdote is not a pattern in and of itself, but it is a kind of evidence. And the trick, the way one figures out whether there is a pattern, does initially involve looking at anecdotes. You can't look at data because data only exists after you have set out to collect it. Right. What causes you to set out to collect it are patterns that one informally notices, which actually are the first step in the scientific method. Observation involves looking at patterns and saying, I wonder why this is true. Here's a possible explanation. And if this possible explanation was correct, these other things would be true. And then I can go look for those other things and see if they are in fact present, right? Observation, hypothesis, prediction, test. That's the method. So when people say they roll their eyes at the idea that an anecdote has caught your attention, what they are really doing is interrupting the first step in the scientific method. And I would point out that, yes, it is true that it is preferable when one has anecdotes that are suggestive of a pattern, right? Anecdotes, say, people collected in a Facebook group reporting symptoms that are not identical but are suggestive of some sort of underlying pathology, that should cause rigorous tests to be done. That's what one wants to happen. But when there is resistance to running those tests, when there is resistance to analyzing the evidence that has accumulated, then we are left with the anecdotes, not by choice, but that's simply what is present for us to evaluate. And so there's something, I would say, diabolical about claiming that something is safe and then ignoring evidence that it might not be so safe, and then chastising those who are looking at the evidence that exists, the anecdotes, and saying you don't have a right to do that because anecdotes aren't science, right? That's all nonsense. Right. Have I misdescribed any of this?
No, I think that's accurate. I mean, I think it was Charles Sanders Peirce who said, do not block the course of inquiry. And that's what's happening here, is the course of inquiry is being blocked. Actually, there have been quite a number of published case studies. And so this is interesting because high-level medical journals do publish single case studies, or a case study of 3 individuals or 7 individuals or that kind of thing. I could send you links to published case studies of apparent severe adverse events after these COVID vaccines, some of them neurological in nature. So it isn't even true to say that no respectable journal will publish something except for a large, blinded trial or something like that. That's not true. They publish case studies all the time. And then after the case studies come in, then they might go out and gather more. Another thing that I would want to mention would be that testimony is always going to be important. Even if a scientist does a study, you're going to be dependent on the scientist's testimony. That, I mean, if he could lie, there is such a thing as scientific fraud. So ultimately, we're going to be dependent on testimony unless you want to get deeper down to, sense data or something really underlying. But, testimony is at a pretty fundamental level epistemologically. Moreover, when you do even larger scientific studies, you're going to be using to some extent anecdotal information as far as does the patient say that this symptom has resolved? I've been reading a lot more scientific papers than I ever, had before, medical papers in researching this. And you'll find, the researchers will say, okay, that the patient said that they had experienced such and such many patients said they experienced such and such degree of resolution in their pain for whatever the medication might be, to find out if a medication is effective. So they're taking the word for it of those patients and recording it. So in that sense, anecdotes are feeding into scientific investigation, even the most formal kind of scientific investigation at multiple different levels.
Yes, it's absolutely maddening to me as somebody who practices science that we would dismiss anecdote. Right? If I don't have those anecdotal patterns to work from in order to figure out what hypothesis might be worth testing, then there's no way to start. And it occurs to me, even just talking to you right now, that we have medicine functioning at different levels, right? We have public health and we have, official guidance on what drugs work on which conditions and things like this. But the practice of medicine that takes place in a doctor's office is in fact supposed to be about the doctor's ability to work from anecdote and figure out what it suggests about what you likely have, what things tend to work for people who have similar types of diseases. Doctors are actually supposed to test hypotheses at a level that isn't formal. Right? They're supposed to say, well, gee, that sounds like you might have a problem, a generalized inflammation problem. If they're a good doctor, they might say, let's figure out what's causing the inflammation. A regular doctor might say, let's treat the inflammation, But in any case, the point is, doctors are not running studies on large numbers of patients in general. They are working with individuals whose presentation is individual by its very nature. And when they do it right, they end up alleviating symptoms and treating disorders in a way that's effective. So at some level, I feel like we are being fed epistemological nonsense so that we will not be able to recognize a pattern that is obvious in front of us.
Yes. Well, and the doctor himself might then use induction. Doctors will say to me, I had a patient who, I don't know how many times you've heard a doctor say that. Oh, yeah, I've had patients who, I had a patient who. And so then that will lead a doctor to maybe use a medication more often because it's worked on his patients. So doctors are doing informal science like that all the time and just in their own practices.
Absolutely. And I would also, I think I mentioned it earlier, but we also have systems set up so that we are not left with anecdotal evidence. We have the VAERS system in the US, for example, which is supposed to capture adverse events following vaccination. And should there be a pattern, doesn't mean that every instance that shows up in the VAERS system will be caused by a vaccine. But if we simply record every time somebody has had a serious medical incident in close proximity to a vaccination event, if we collect all of that evidence, we'll be able to say, hey, look, if there was nothing with these vaccines, then the rate at which people have, let's say, a heart attack following this vaccination shouldn't be any different than the rate at which they have a heart attack following the flu vaccine. And if the rate is 10 times, 50 times higher, then you say, well, I wonder why these two groups of people who got a vaccination and then went home and had their event, why are these two groups so different? Right. So what I'm constantly told is that the VAERS system is unreliable, and therefore that the huge spike in adverse events following the COVID vaccines is not meaningful. But nobody seems to know what that implies. They seem to think that implies that these things are safe, which it doesn't. At best, it implies that we don't know how safe they are.
And it is odd that they suddenly decided that it was unreliable this year. It was strangely reliable through 2020, through 2019, let's say through flu season. Pre-COVID, the VAERS system was considered reliable. And oddly enough, when 2021 came around and we rolled out the COVID-19 vaccines, it became abruptly unreliable. I don't know how that happened. Or to put it differently, previously it was regarded, if anything, as needing to be multiplied by a multiplying factor. So if it was unreliable in any way, it was by under-reporting rather than by over-reporting. Now suddenly we're supposed to believe it's vastly over-reported, and I don't know why we should be so confident of that.
Right. We can't possibly be confident of that. But I guess I would say, again, I don't want to give the benefit of the doubt because I don't believe it is a reasonable doubt. But if we bend over backwards to grant everything that those who claim these vaccines are safe want us to believe, at best, we've got a system that doesn't tell us how safe they are. It certainly doesn't tell us that there's no problem.
That they are safe. Right. And let me also add that the pop-up you get on Facebook or any of these other places will say, and are continuing to be monitored for safety. So it won't just say that they're safe. It'll say they're being carefully monitored. And I'm going, where is this happening? Where is this continuing monitoring happening if not through VAERS? Is there some secret system that they're using to being continually monitoring? No, obviously the VAERS system was supposed to be that system.
Right.
And so that part of it should be deleted in any event if they're now going to say that that system has no monitoring capability because it's wildly unreliable.
The other place you could monitor it is you could continue to monitor the level of events in the control group of the initial safety trial versus the treatment group, but they didn't allow that either. My understanding is that they treated everybody after the short initial test period. So there is no remaining control group. So again, we have a system that for whatever reason is incapable of delivering us a signal that these vaccines are dangerous, even if they are. And so what we are left with is a world of anecdotes that we are told we must ignore, which epistemologically does not make any sense. And it must be driving you crazy as an epistemologist to be in the group that is held at the level of anecdote and then to watch the conversation continue as if nothing abnormal is taking place.
Right. And then when you would be willing to be studied and you're not being contacted to be studied. I mean, not just me, but others would make our medical information. If someone wanted to do like a retrospective study or something like that, it's like, fine. If you would like to turn us into data, we are only too happy to be turned into data. And there's so far quite a lack of interest in that.
So to fill that in, and I think most people probably will figure it out on their own, but were you to find yourself in this group, you have taken a vaccine, something has happened to your life, you discover there are many others, you don't know whether you're stuck with these symptoms permanently, whether they will clear up on their own, whether you're stuck with them except if a treatment is found, and hopefully it will be. And so, of course, you want to be studied. The amount of good that would come from understanding what has happened to you is potentially huge, and the benefit of it would go to you. So there's no mystery that there are lots of people waiting to have somebody say, all right, I'm sick of being an anecdote. Let's turn me into data, figure out what's going on so we can help the others who have the same condition.
Right.
And yet it doesn't happen.
It's not happening. And partly I want to be as fair as I can and say, well, it's still maybe early days. Maybe it will happen soon. I don't know what to say. I don't know to what extent. And as I say, I could send you links to individual case studies. So those guys who did those, they're out there doing this. But I'm not terribly hopeful. I'm not terribly sanguine because I do think there is a disincentive. There was one doctor who put it in my chart that I said this happened after the vaccine, but he didn't say that he thought it, but he said it verbally to me. And so that was interesting to me. So one of the immunologists, he put it into his notes. I believe this is an autoimmune thing. But the neurologist just recorded what I had said, but verbally he said to me that he believed this was caused by the vaccine. So I do think there is nervousness. I do think there is wariness in the medical community about, and possibly in the research community as well. I'd be interested to hear some anecdotes from medical researchers who are a little different from necessarily the doctors with boots on the ground as to whether they think that this is dangerous to them if they were to publish studies of that. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, there's a question about the formal danger to people's careers, and then there's a lower level of coercion where people are socially concerned of what happens if they acknowledge a hazard. And I will point out, if you look at what's happening to Eric Clapton, there is a very clear message. Here we have a person, his nickname is Slowhand, right? This is a person who is famous for what he does with his hands. He found himself unable to do what he has done in life following a vaccination. Again, he can't be an anti-vaxxer. He took the vaccine willingly, was injured. And let's say that he was the only person on earth who had this, or let's say that it was a pure coincidence and not causal somehow. Still, how unkind is it to not allow a human being to discuss his own experience, an experience that any of the rest of us in his shoes would be saying the same thing. I feel like this vaccine caused this problem with my hands, the way that
ruined my life.
Right, ruined my life. And so I guess the point is I'm watching him stigmatized publicly as if he is somehow the culprit.
Right.
When at worst, he has drawn a connection that doesn't deserve to be drawn. And more likely, actually, he's suffered an injury and he's entitled to talk about it. Right. It just seems to me so cruel that society would take a position that those who have had an experience must be silent about it for fear that it will cause other people to worry about something which they should probably worry about.
Right, exactly. It should be possible to say, you should be a little more worried about that. I'm perfectly open to saying, yeah, I think people should be more worried about this. I just today read an article from Australia. I don't remember the name of the person. And I think it was a heart attack. I think he had, or no, maybe it was just myocarditis. Anyway, it was a heart inflammation. And he was interviewed and they let him tell his story and it went into the news, but he had to say over and over and over again in the story, I'm not trying to make anybody vaccine hesitant. It's not my goal to make anyone hesitant about getting the vaccine here in Australia. And then he would go, but at the same time, I do think this should be studied more, et cetera, et cetera. And he was having trouble getting his thing reported to the Australian version of VAERS. He had to do it himself, but he believed that if his doctor did it, it would have more, it would be taken more seriously or whatever. And the doctor said, I'm too busy. You get online and do it type thing. And so even the person writing the articles seemed to accept that it had been caused, but kept saying rare over and over again, But it bothered me. There was something very propagandistic about the fact that this man could only get his story told if he said about 5 times, I'm not trying to make anybody vaccine hesitant. Well, what the heck? He should be allowed to say, man, I think maybe people should be more hesitant about this, and you still ought to tell his story. It's an interesting story.
Well, I almost feel like this is an epistemological crime. I don't know if that's a category, but I think the point is a human being is not built for a world of formal science. A human being is a brilliant creature that is capable of taking information. Some of that information will appear meaningful and turn out not to be, right? But a human being needs to be able to say, look, my friend group went and got vaccinated and there wasn't an incident among them. But you can't say that if somebody who had had an incident would have to think twice about speaking publicly about it, or they would have a social catastrophe on their hands, right? So the point is, you don't know. It seems like the events are rare, but the rarity may in part, how many people have been effectively silenced watching what's happening to Eric Clapton and saying, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going
simply not making the connection. That is true as well. I watched an interview with a lady. Her first name is Deborah. She was a physician's assistant. You probably know the interview I'm talking about. Anyway, she was told by her fellow medical practitioners, you file the VAERS reports, we're too busy, there are too many of them, et cetera, even though they were sufficiently important that they were actually required by law to do it. But they let her do it for them for a while, and then they said, no, just do it on your own patients. Anyway, she was oh man, I forgot where I'm going with this, but I know what it was. She was saying that she had a colleague, an oncologist, who took to asking his patients, have you been vaccinated? So when their cancer was coming back out of remission, her colleague was noticing the connection and the patients were not. So I'm gonna tell you an anecdote. I'm gonna blind it a little bit here because this person hasn't given me permission, but I was talking to someone about my own experience, and she said to me, and this was a medical person in the medical field, and she said to me, oh, it's so interesting that you had the vaccine and you had this happen. That's odd. I had this thing where I was in terrible pain, and I was out in the sun, and I almost anaphylacted with a temperature reaction and so forth. And then I woke up in the middle of the night, I was screaming in pain. And she said, but I do think the vaccine is safe. So she had made no connection whatsoever until she heard my story. And she's a medical person. So I think it is underreported. And I think one reason is what you're saying. People are afraid of social ostracism. So we can't make that argument. Arguments from silence kind of stink anyway, but we can't make that argument from silence. I haven't heard anybody say anything, so it must not have happened in my friend group. That's a very weak argument. But also because I think there are cases where there is a plausible connection, but people are not making it because they're, as we say, their prior is so low. And so when their prior is really low, then they're not going to make that connection.
Right. Now, I, of course, haven't a clue what we are supposed to do with this, right? What ends up happening is those of us who have, I guess, accepted the price of talking about our negative experiences or our skepticism, our alarm, our inability to look away from the evidence that's accumulated in the VAERS system or the yellow card system, right? We have elected to pay a price. And so, or we have refused to dodge that price, I guess. And we talk to each other. And so that is liable to be distorting in a sense, right? When you find that you've got a group of people who is already paid the price and are interacting. And then you have another group that isn't paying the price, that is surrounded by a great deal of silence on the matter, also not getting a clear picture. And of course, I think the problem is, I've said this in other contexts, that science is a very beautiful and powerful process, but it is also a fragile process, that it depends on certain conditions being met. And it is not capable of overcoming something like a propaganda campaign that keeps evidence from emerging to a place where we can evaluate it.
Right.
And so I've been stigmatized as all sorts of things, including an anti-vaxxer. And I cannot seem to break through the wall of people who need to be thinking about why it is that people like you and I would end up in this very unpleasant situation of talking publicly about something that powerful forces do not want discussed. Now, I know,
or just blowing my own privacy. Like,
right.
How many people want to go out there? I'm lucky, right? My husband supports me. All right. So I don't think he's going to lose his job because I came out and did this, so I'm not going to be penalized nearly even as much as you have. But who wants to go out there and tell people I have horrible tailbone pain? It's usually something you keep private. It took me months to agree to pay, even that much of a price. But you're right. We don't want to be in a bubble. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said that science demands a particular kind of honesty, which is that you're willing to bend over backwards to bring in things that might possibly be contrary to your own view. And he was funny. He says, I don't care if you lie to your girlfriend, but when you're a scientist, you don't lie as a scientist. And so that's that fragility. I think he, in a sense, sensed that fragility that you're talking about there. And I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I do fear that signal is being broken, as you say, and public trust is certainly eroded. And the proceeding of science, at least in things surrounding COVID, is being broken in the world as a whole. I was going to say the United States, but other countries too.
Yeah, other countries too. In fact, absolutely terrible stories coming out of Australia. I interviewed a woman who has terrible immunological sensitivities, including anaphylactic shock as a result of exposure to polyethylene glycol, which is in 2 of the vaccines, and a close relative is in the 3rd, to which she has access. And she's being told she should be vaccinated anyway. She just should simply get vaccinated in a hospital where they can rescue her after she has her anaphylaxis, which is a medically nonsensical position in light of the fact that this disease, as bad as it is not smallpox. It's also rare in Australia, so the chances that anyone is actually protected from COVID itself by her being vaccinated makes no sense. And frankly, many people who were reluctant about vaccination and were vaccinated anyway were vaccinated on the basis that we needed to protect the vulnerable. And if she's not the vulnerable, then who is?
Right, exactly. And now we're hearing that myocarditis in children is mild. So we should be willing to send the children out there, vaccinate a bunch of little kids, and if they get myocarditis, hey, it'll probably be mild. Never mind the fact that COVID would probably be mild if they got COVID. So this is crazy.
COVID would be mild as far as we know. Myocarditis, the idea that this is a mild condition, is preposterous. The idea that you would imagine that it is likely to be mild in children where they have a very long life ahead of them in which bad things can happen, right?
You would even take that risk.
Right. There's no medical justification.
Right.
At best, the justification when it comes to children is that it will protect the old and infirm. But we as a society have never had the conversation where we say it's acceptable to rob young people of health to protect the old and infirm. And I think, frankly, only a sick society would ever make such a choice.
It's ethically horrible.
Right. It's ethically indefensible, Absolutely. In my opinion. And so, yes, we're not having that conversation. We're also not, the other side is not playing fair. Right. Heather and I were very clear before there was evidence of myocarditis being a frequent, I don't mean frequent in terms of the number of people who have it, but frequent among the adverse events. We were alarmed that there was a danger of hazards that we didn't know about yet, and that we should be cautious for that reason. And now, of course, how many people have learned the term myocarditis because it is well understood to be caused by these vaccines? Where is the acknowledgement that, in fact, our caution was well placed?
Right. You predict things well, and you can see that the propaganda machine is getting out ahead of it. So the very fact that we're now being told myocarditis in children is usually mild, they can treat it with, Advil at home or whatever. What is that? That's preliminary propaganda. Yep. It's a prophylactic propaganda, you might say, so that if people say, I told you so, here now we've got a bunch of more, pericarditis and myocarditis cases among children there wouldn't be before. They're like, yeah, we already knew that would happen. We told you it would be fine. And not very many of them are dying. So stop worrying about it. So basically nothing is going to be allowed to shake this. It's a certain view of what should be done. And that view is not going to change, I fear.
Yeah, it's the ultimate epistemological sin, which is to start with your conclusion and work backwards from it and force the evidence to fit it no matter what the evidence suggests. And
my husband likes to use the metaphor of the Pink Panther, if I recall correctly, and he's used this for years, and that in the introduction, he would have a little hole and he would go down the hole, if you've ever seen the cartoon, and then he would pull the hole behind him, and then it would disappear. So
Right.
he's in there. He's locked down in there, and that's what's happening. We're doing the Pink Panther.
Yeah, it's a kind of hermetically sealing a perspective so that whatever evidence there is can't alter it. That is what appears to be happening, and there's just simply nothing apparently that can derail this train, which is the most frightening thing of all. Right? If you had the sense that the medical authorities were grappling with the evidence and that they were actually balancing the question of the harms of COVID, the deaths that will arise from people getting sick with this infection that we have not successfully controlled, and that they were balancing that with the potential harm to people from being vaccinated to prevent the disease, well, then there's a lot of discussion we can have. Adults can understand that this vaccine doesn't have to be completely safe in order to be worthwhile. But what one gets the sense is that we've just sort of definitionally decided it's safe, and that it has nothing to do with evidence, and that evidence, will be dismissed if it arises as it has.
I think that's because if we had that conversation, there might be some recognition that a free people should be permitted as adults to make that decision for themselves, and for the vulnerable children or others who are not legally responsible, for whom they are legally responsible. And that's what must not be allowed to happen, is to allow freedom of choice on this issue.
Well, so I'm betting you and I are going to end up in a different place here, not meaningfully in the current circumstance. I believe it is conceivable that one can imagine a pathogen and a vaccine and an epidemiological pattern in which coercion might be necessary for the benefit of civilization. I don't believe that has remotely happened in this case. Not this disease, not these vaccines, and not these authorities. None of these things justify that coercion. But as an abstract question, I believe such an event could happen. So I'm hesitant to say that this is an issue of free choice, because although I believe it should be, that in this case, it should be a matter of free choice, because the medical authorities are not doing their job. They are in breach of social contract with us, that they have actually made us vulnerable. They have failed to give us good advice. They have failed to use the tools at their disposal to control the disease without exposing us to the hazards of these vaccines. And when it comes to kids, they have demonstrated that they actually are not bound by any normal ethical calculation, right?
Or cost benefit. And that's the whole question, is cost benefit and utilities and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I would take the position that it shouldn't ever be coerced. But a year or two ago, maybe I would have been where you are. And I think that watching it in real time has gotten me to the point where I'm just like, yep, even if it's bubonic plague and we have a safe vaccine. And I think this takes us into, of course, political philosophy, which is not even my field, but the sort of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely issue. And so that, that power to make you go out there and get something suck into your body, it's a pretty big power. And I think we are seeing it go to people's head. But something I think you and I may agree about is a statement that a friend made to me online. He said, human beings have a great desire to be ruled by experts. And he clearly didn't think that was a good thing. And I think that you and I are both maybe seeing the concern where that human desire is, here, take it away from me, take this decision away from me and just rule me for my own good. And that is backfiring on us in a big, big way here in this particular epidemic.
Well, let me ask you a question. I agree with that. And my basic sense is, in the current circumstance, at the point that civilization has failed to live up to its responsibility to its citizens, where it has put us, in harm's way and prioritize the interests of pharma or whatever else, where we are just simply carried along in this dangerous trajectory, then yes, we have the right to opt out. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, let's just take an extreme case. Let's say that a Christian Scientist family, that the child of a Christian Scientist family, Christian Scientists, as I understand it, mm-hmm. do not believe in medical intervention. Let's say that a child from this family has been bitten by a rabid animal. Right. Now, a bite by a rabid animal is highly likely to cause rabies. And once the symptoms of rabies begin, I believe there's only one case in history where a person has ever survived. So it is a fatal disease and a terrible, terrible death. In that case, I would be in favor of coercing the use of the vaccine, which can save this child's life, and is comparatively safe as far as I know. I've had a rabies vaccine, although not the post-exposure one. I've had the pre-exposure one. But nonetheless, in that case, I believe coercion would be justified and freedom of choice would not trump that choice.
I think what we're up against here is that there is no getting away from what I believe Aristotle called phronesis, which is a kind of wisdom in governance. We're not going to be able to get away from the need for wisdom in governance. But generally, what free societies have done is to try to keep those kinds of extreme scenarios to a minimum so that they're being done on an individual case-by-case basis. I mean, this is, for example, why involuntary committal for insanity, for example, is something that's done on an individual basis with a finding before a judge. And, you've got to have a certain number of expert witnesses and that kind of thing, because you want to safeguard the freedom of the individual. And have generally shied away from giving a huge amount of power to a government entity, particularly a government entity that governs a very large number of people, millions and billions even of people, then that becomes all that much more dangerous, because one person in that position who's making very, very bad judgment can harm a whole lot of people. And I think that is what we're seeing happening here.
Oh, well, I agree. And I think whatever the explanation, the public health authorities are effectively delivering us to a for-profit entity that insists that its product is so good that it must be mandated. And the evidence just simply doesn't support that conclusion. So it's not that what I'm saying, I do not want to represent myself as believing that personal choice is the top priority. Right. It's a very high priority, but there are circumstances that rise to a higher level of significance. I just don't think, I don't think we are remotely there. Right. This is not the disease. These are not the vaccines, and these are not the public health authorities. All three of those things are independently capable of rendering the coercion invalid. This disease is dangerous to people with comorbidities. It is a terrible disease. It's damaging, but it is not deadly to most people who contract it. These vaccines are not so safe that it's a non-issue. We have a huge adverse event signal and nobody chasing it down. And the public health authorities, however many months we are now into this pandemic, still have yet to recommend vitamin D to anyone.
They've made mistake after mistake after mistake. And they're also interfering in things like economics where they have no expertise whatsoever. And that's terrifying. I mean, something like ordering a lockdown is not really a public health decision alone. It's an economic decision. So whoever said that Anthony Fauci is an expert in economics.
Right. And, it is not in any way clear that a proper medical analysis was done about the net impact of that lockdown when you take into account things like abuse that takes place in a world where people are disconnected, child abuse, for example, depression, medical checkups for diseases that are deadly in their own right.
Right.
So yes, for whatever reason, decisions were made like this is a simple matter of there's one objective of civilization, and it is to fend off COVID, which we have incidentally done a terrible job of.
Right. Not
but everything
anyway.
Right. But we're willing to crash the rest of everything to do that one thing. Well, that's not, none of us signed up for that.
Right. Well, in a book that I think is relevant here is one of my favorites, is The Vision of the Anointed, by Thomas Sowell. And he talks about the vision of the anointed and the tragic vision. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but the vision of the anointed is that there are solutions. What we're looking for are solutions. And the tragic vision is that there are no solutions. There are trade-offs and compromises, and there are always going to be trade-offs. What we are seeing in COVID and in other areas as well, like inflation and so forth, is the imposition of the vision of the anointed. We're going to solve this. We're going to fix this. And it's not solving it, first of all, but it's also causing all of the other problems because of that solution mindset rather than trade-off and compromise mindset.
Yeah, that's interesting. The solution mindset is the mindset of a child, right? A child sees the problem and wants it fixed. The adult understands that the fix has costs too, and that the benefit has to outweigh those costs, and that one has to integrate into that calculation something about the unknowns. Right. And that, yes, if the benefit is sufficient to overcome all of the costs that we can identify and a reasonable estimate of the costs we cannot identify in advance, then it is worth contemplating. But that doesn't appear to have been done here at all.
And we have to be ready to change course, too, if we find that, oh, man, you've made a mistake, Absolutely.
Right. So in our book, my wife and I advocate for the precautionary principle that one has to look at the potential hazards of these things. We acknowledge that that's a very difficult principle to operationalize well, but as a guiding principle, the recognition that solution making always has unintended consequences and that we need to be ready for them. And then we need to be able to reverse course, right? Reversing course is the best protection we have. It's the fail-safe. Right. It is exactly the opposite of a system in which, having said the word safe and effective, we are just going to simply declare that that is the fact, irrespective of what evidence may emerge. Is it's like philosophy by a 5-year-old.
Right. It's terrifying, and it's an application of the sunk cost fallacy in a sense. We've done all of this. And it'll make it look like it was all for nothing if we don't double down. And it's like, well, you have to be willing to admit that you were wrong. So I'm hoping that by telling my story, giving up my privacy, I can kind of help people, at least to the extent that it does lie within their choice and their decision, to think again. And I'm not under any illusions that any member of government is going to think again because he hears my anecdote, or even my walking into, as it were, a virtual room full of anecdotes and my evaluation of that as an epistemologist. But there might be some lawmakers here or there that can use this to help them, and certainly individuals who can hopefully use it to guide their own decisions.
Wow. Well, I must say, I love the sunk cost fallacy. It's a really important recognition, but I hadn't thought of it this way, that in some sense, the large number of people who you have run into who appear to have been injured and are suffering silently, because to pursue a solution to your injury would be to admit that it exists, that in effect, it's like a class of non-citizens who exist because they are the sunk costs of a policy that we could change, that we could accept was an error, but something is going to insist on having been right, even when it was very wrong. And that's a terrifying place to find civilization has descended to.
It is, especially expanding it to children. And I hope that I am wrong as far as the prevalence of really bad side effects among children. I would love for it to be the case that just as children don't get COVID as badly as a lot of adults, they maybe will also not get side effects as badly as adults. I don't think we can infer the one from the other at all. It doesn't seem to me medically. So I hope we don't get some explosion, but in a dark way, a very dark way. It will be interesting to see what happens if we start getting a very large number of anecdotes of children ages 5 through 11 having terrible, terrible side effects, and the medical establishment saying, la, 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 I can't hear you, or the government establishment saying, I can't hear you. Is that going to change anything? Is anything going to happen to make them change course? I don't know.
Well, unfortunately, I think the Maddie de Garay story,
it's a bad sign, isn't it?
It's an awful sign. And I would also say that no matter what, we are again in the same circumstance where you can tell we have no reason to believe that vaccinating these children is safe. It doesn't mean it will be harmful, but it means that we cannot rule out that it will be harmful. And there are signs that mean that we should be very concerned. And because healthy children are not severely harmed by COVID, it is it is an evil choice for us to be making. And the fact that after ignoring a large group of people who appears to have been injured by vaccines that they were told were safe and effective, at seeing that not only have these vaccines failed with regard to safety, but they also have failed with respect to effectiveness. The fact that we're talking about boosters being necessary for people six months down the road, this tells us that safe and effective didn't turn out to be right. And the people who assured us that that was true either knew better and lied, or they didn't know better and should have.
And they were caught by surprise, and now they're going to just double down and say, well, then I guess we just got to do it.
I guess my point would be, though, it's not doubling down when you add children to the mix, right? That is ratcheting up. That is a new level of indifference to potential harm.
It is. And it will be, I fear, indifference to actual harm. The other thing that strikes me, and maybe has a little bit of an echo of communism, and I hesitate to use this word, but you'll see where I'm going with it in a minute, is that the de Garays were so pro-vax that they entered 3 of their children into the trial. Maddie volunteered. From the story that I've heard is that 2 of her siblings were going to be in the trial, and they apparently were fine. And then she said, oh, I want to help too, because I want to help to end the pandemic. And her parents were thrilled to let her do it. And then this happened, and her parents are like, oh my goodness, this happened to us. And the fact that they were so committed to the system was not good enough to get them listened to. Okay. And so I think we find that where we have people who've been sort of mugged by reality, and they were loudly in affirmation of the system. Like people who were like, I'm a good Soviet comrade. Please listen to me. Our food supply system is not working or whatever. I'm trying to help the party. Right. And then it was like, we don't want to hear what you're saying. Shut up. So it's, the odd thing is, you would maybe have thought that the depth of commitment that this family had to the vaccination efforts, even for COVID specifically, would have won them a hearing, but it did not.
It's a terrifying, terrifying point, right? These are people who more than did their part. Right? And if anyone is deserving of being listened to, being treated at the highest possible level, being heralded as a hero. I mean, if anybody is a hero of this pandemic, this little girl is. She volunteered to test a vaccine so that so the pandemic could be ended, was injured, right? This is a fallen soldier at some level. How dare we ignore her? That's it's a very upsetting point. I had not thought about it that way, but my God.
I know. It's terrible. It's really, and I fear we're going to see more of it. And so I guess what I'm going to say to parents for sure is, if you have to homeschool your kid or whatever you have to do, I would urge them not to do this. That would be my message, that, you don't have to take the responsibility for that, but that's something that I would say to parents.
Well, I would certainly say, look at the evidence.
Right. And you're the parent. You've got to make a decision here.
You've got to make a decision. And the real question is, are you the parent? I've watched these public health messages, and they blur this distinction between getting kids vaccinated to end the pandemic and getting kids vaccinated to protect them from COVID. The second one of these things does not need to be done for a healthy child.
Right.
As far as we know. So the idea that we're going to just blur that line and say, oh, it's good to vaccinate children when actually it puts them in harm's way and does not benefit them. In fact, it may actually, let's say that the vaccine works in children the way it works in adults. It may stave off COVID. They may get their boosters. They may face the hazards that come along with them until they're no longer so young that COVID doesn't threaten them. Right? It's like we might.
Right. I see what you're saying.
So the point is, you as a parent are supposed to do what is in this child's interest. And frankly, you are supposed to tell society that it does not have the right to take health from your child to protect others. Right? You're supposed to say that. And if somebody came to you and said, hey, you know what? It happens that your kid is a match for my grandmother who needs a kidney, and your kid has two. Right? So we're just going to take one. Your kid will be fine. People live with one kidney. You're supposed to say, no, I'm very sorry about what's happened to your grandmother, but no, right? This is that situation. The fact is, this disease is not one that these kids need a vaccine to fend off, and these vaccines are not safe enough to give it to children. So, look, I understand that if I say that out loud, I'm the witch. I get it. On the other hand, what kind of person would I be if I didn't say it out loud? It's too clear. The evidence is clear. Where are the children, the healthy children who have been killed by COVID? Right?
Yeah, it's like incredibly improbable. It's just very, 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 even on the CDC's own estimate, which I think is a poor estimate. What is it? One child for every million vaccinated might be saved. That is their estimate.
Right. And when there has been a search for cases in which healthy children have died of COVID, literally they have not been found. So again, we could have instances in which a child has comorbidities that change the cost-benefit analysis. But if your child is a normal, healthy child, then you have to ask yourself, am I doing this for their benefit, or am I doing it for somebody else's benefit, and whose? Right?
Or am I just doing it because I'm afraid, or because what I think is going to happen a lot is the poor are going to be hurt. If I can put it this way, okay, I got to work. Somebody says, I got to work. My husband's got to work. We can't pay the rent if we don't work. My kid has to be able to go to public school. And therefore, because that's where they go during the day while mother and father are at work, they won't let them go to public school. So I have no choice. And that coercion will fall squarely and heavily on the people who are not lucky enough to be able to homeschool or take the child out or put the child in a separate private school.
Yep. All right. Well, I think I want to say one more thing before we close this out, and then I will let you have whatever last word you want to have. But I think I want to say, I know from experience that this conversation is going to get me in trouble yet again. And I want to ask people who think that makes sense, who think that this conversation is a problem, right? And that somebody who would have this conversation needs to be held responsible, is the current vernacular. I want you to think about what kind of society it is in which this conversation is one that isn't allowed to be had. You're talking about a conversation between two doctors of philosophy about questions of human health, about our responsibilities to each other, about the responsibilities of those who govern us to the citizenry. This is a conversation that needs to be had. And to the extent that you are scandalized by us having it, by a person who believes they have been injured, a person who is more than qualified to evaluate the likelihood that that is simply a mere coincidence versus the likelihood that there is a causal relationship between the vaccine that she took and the injury that she has experienced. If you believe that this conversation is irresponsible, then I would ask you to look at yourself in the mirror and say, what kind of society are you building if you're going to rule out a conversation like this? Even if there are elements of this conversation that are wrong, I know that I have attempted to be responsible in this conversation. I can tell that you are attempting to be responsible. And the fact is, if you can't handle the content of this conversation, I believe that's on you. Right. All right. Lydia McGrew, what would you like to close us out with?
Wow, that was so good, Bret. I don't know if I could better that, actually, because what I thought of while you were talking there was, being much younger, you and I are probably of a similar age. These are the kind of conversations we had all the time in graduate school, right? You'd have people who disagreed very strongly about the role of government. You'd have your libertarian over here, and you'd have your conservative over here, and your liberal over here, and your anarchist or whatever. And you'd sit up till the middle of the night debating these things because we were young and it was fun, and it was considered that this is part of living in a free country. And no, we weren't publishing them and putting them on YouTube because there was no YouTube. But that's not the point. It never would have occurred to us to say that this is a dangerous thing for people to overhear. Such conversations should not be dangerous for people to overhear among a free people, so that a free people can think and can listen to these conversations, and then can just ponder these things and can vote in an informed manner for the rulers and for their rules. And so that is confirming what you're saying, just taking me back to the days of my youth when we used to have these arguments all the time. Let's continue having them, because that's really important.
Absolutely. I am reminded that it wasn't so long ago that we could have vigorous disagreements with each other and not assume that it was collapse of morality in the other person that was responsible for them having a different perspective.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, Lydia McGrew, I really appreciate your willingness to put your story into public so that we can all grapple with its meaning and think about what it implies about our collective predicament. And I really appreciate the care you've put into thinking about this issue. And all I can say is I can't really know what it is that you're going through, but I can try, and I can appreciate how frightening and frustrating it must be. And I wish you the best of luck in finding medical professionals who are willing to listen and to do what medical professionals are supposed to do, to responsibly experiment and find treatments for you. And I hope that your immune system figures itself out and corrects the problem.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that, Bret. And I appreciate you taking these risks, because without people like you who are willing to take risks that you should not have to take, information would be stifled even further. And so keep going. Keep doing that.
Appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks so much. Be well, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks.